So the first content patch for the War Within is going to be WoW's 20th anniversary, and this is going to include a ton of new content, but the thing I'm most excited for is the Black Rock Depths raid. So they're taking the old dungeon and they're remaking a bunch of the bosses. So we're going to be able to run through and defeat 5 mini bosses and 8 bosses, and we're going to be able to do this raid on Raid Finder, Normal, and Heroic. And if you ever played back in Vanilla or for the launch of Classic and you ran this dungeon, you'll have realized that a lot of the items have a bunch of somewhat interesting procs. So even outside of trinkets, you have a bunch of weapon procs, and then you have a bunch of procs on different pieces of gear. And to tie into that, we recently got a bunch of data mining on a bunch of the items we're going to be able to get from the Black Rock Depths raid. A bunch of them being completely new, but being very inspired by old items, and a bunch of them being updated versions from the dungeon. So that's mainly what I want to go over in this video. Now, before we go over the items themselves, we have to go over if these items are actually going to be usable. So more specifically, what item level all of these items are going to be, because we did actually get a chart on the item levels of the different bosses throughout this raid, because starting in Dragonflight, as you progress throughout a raid, the item levels get higher, and the same thing is going to happen with this new raid. So Raid Finder item levels are going to go from 584 up to 593. Normal item levels are going to go from 597 up to 606, and heroic item levels are going to go from 610 up to 619. And what's also really interesting about this is just following the exact same item levels of the first raid of the War Within. So when Narubar Palace releases, if you go do heroic, it'll be the exact same item levels, 610 up to 619. And since the majority of the player base does not get into mythic raiding, this raid is actually going to have competitive gear, which is super exciting. And also, all the items we're going over are specifically the items with interesting procs or effects on them. There's going to be a bunch of other just normal pieces of gear that also drops in this raid. So starting off, we have a dagger called Flame Lash's Fiery Spike. This dagger does not have any secondary stats, but the special effect is your melee attacks have a chance to blast a target with fire, dealing some amount of fire damage every 3 seconds for 30 seconds. Now, with all of these items with like special procs, the usefulness of them is generally going to come down to how much stats it gives or how much damage it deals, the balancing of it. But what's pretty interesting with this dagger is that it removes the secondary stats, so that means a proc has to be very strong for this to actually be usable. And I think if this dagger is scaled well, this damage over time could be really good, specifically on bosses, because it's a 30-second dot that deals damage every 3 seconds. So it's not going to be super strong on, say, if you're clearing a Mythic Plus up until you get to the boss. But if you're doing a raid, most of the difficult things are actually the bosses. So this could be decent on a boss. Then we have a trinket called the Heart of Rokor. It gives you crit, and your melee and range attacks grant 242 strength, and this lasts 15 seconds, stacking up to 10 times. Now this seems like a trinket that would be incredibly strong. A stacking main stat buff is usually what would be on trinkets that end up being ridiculously strong. Then we have a Bottled Magma, which is another trinket, gives you intellect, and your heals have a chance to release a living magma that will travel to the lowest health enemy within 50 yards and heal them for some amount. And also keep in mind, all these items are at 584 item level. Their base damages or stats can be upgraded quite a bit, especially once you get into higher difficulties of the raid, and a lot of these effects will be able to be scaled by other things. But this trinket has like the base heal at 250,000, and since this is seemingly a smart heal, this trinket I think could potentially be ridiculously strong. Then we have another trinket, the Molten Furnace, gives you versatility, and the use of this is absorbs 30% of the damage you take up to some amount of total damage. It's currently showing 2.2 million, and every 750,000 damage absorbed, you release a wave of heat dealing some amount of fire damage split between all enemies in 5 yards, has a 2-minute cooldown, and this trinket is probably going to be completely determined on how much damage it actually deals, because I think a lot of tanks in modern WoW don't use defensive trinkets unless they're doing like the highest end of possible content, and even then tanks are usually only using cheat death trinkets or things that are absurdly strong if they're defensive. But this could potentially do a lot of damage. Then we have Golem Gearbox, another trinket, gives you agility or strength, and then the equipped is the gearbox is wound each time you cause a non-periodic crit. When wound 3 times, unleash a torrent of flames dealing some amount of fire damage, is at 170k. The gearbox can cannot be wound more than once every 2.5 seconds, and unless the damage on this thing is absurdly badly tuned, this thing sounds ridiculous because it gets wound for every crit and it only has a 2.5 second internal cooldown on being able to wind up another gear, and you only need 3. So if you hit crits at the perfect timing, you can proc this trinket in under 10 seconds every time. So the damage would have to be so absurdly badly tuned for this thing to not be good. And then we have Doperel's Calling Rune, which is another trinket, gives you intellect, and your spells have a chance to call on a Doperel to backstab your target, dealing some amount of physical damage. Also, what's really weird about this trinket is it gives you intellect, but you're summoning something to deal physical damage. Now, the physical damage on this does actually seem to be pretty good. At this low item level, it's 250,000, so maybe they did the physical damage so it won't be scaling with other effects so they can have the damage a bit higher, or they're just doing it to add more flavor to the item. And then finally, for the new items, we actually have set pieces, a one-hander and an offhander. So the mace is the Hammer of Grace, and the offhand is Tharizdun's Royal Scepter. Now, the 2-piece bonus of having both of these weapons is your heals have a chance to grant Linger and Grace on the target for 15 seconds. Your next direct healing spell will consume a Linger and Grace healing the target for 30% of the amount healed, up to some amount of healing. Now, depending on the proc rate of this effect sounds ridiculously strong, because this Linger and Grace you put on a target will proc off direct healing anybody else. So you heal somebody, it puts Linger and Grace on them, and then you cast a direct heal on somebody else. It'll then proc the Linger and Grace to heal for 30% of that amount. So just the set effect on these weapons can actually be quite good, and also these weapons don't lose anything compared to other weapons. They still have their secondary stats. But this definitely seems really interesting, and I definitely think they should do more things like this in retail for the new content. Just having like a couple items that you put together for a set is super interesting, even if the set effect isn't like crazy strong. Now, on top of those new items, we also have a bunch of original items from the dungeon returning and being remade in some way. So first off, we have the Circle of Flame, and you'll be able to see both items in the video, but I'm only going to be going over the new version. So starting off, we have a Circle of Flame, which is a cloth helm. Also, it only has one secondary stat, but it seems like a lot of secondary stats. It just gives versatility. So I don't think you're necessarily losing secondary stats, but it has an on-use effect that it channels some amount of health into mana every 1 second for 10 seconds, and it's a 1-minute cooldown. And on the item, it's 26,000 health, so it actually can be a decent bit of mana, and this is just an additional effect on a helmet. So it's quite interesting and could potentially be a bunch of extra mana basically for free. And then next up, we have the Naggle Ring, and this ring only gives stamina, so no secondary stats, but the effect is when struck in combat, you have a chance to deal some amount of arcane damage to the attacker. Now, what's crazy about this is on this item, and remember it's 584 item level, the damage is at 315,000 arcane damage. Now, unless this has an incredibly low proc rate, that's a lot of overall damage, but I do think it actually needs a lot of damage because no secondary stats on your rings is pretty crazy, but I could definitely see some tanks in Mythic Plus wanting to use this ring because it could potentially add a lot of additional damage. And next we have the Burst of Knowledge Trinket, gives you intelligence, and it has an on use. Each spell cast within 20 seconds will grant a stacking bonus of some amount of intellect. It's currently at like 1800, which is quite a lot. This expires after 20 seconds. Abilities with no mana cost will not trigger this trinket. Now, what's interesting with this is unless it has some internal limit that it's not showing on the item, you may be able to get some absurd amounts of intellect, and depending on the class or spec you're playing, you may have a lot of haste and you may be able to get off a lot of spells that cost mana. And even more specifically, something like a healer could potentially get some crazy use from this. I could think of like a druid just having all insta-cast hots that's now just stacking up this crazy amount of intellect. And then we have the Force of Will Trinket, gives you versatility, and the equipped is when struck, you have a chance to reduce all damage taken by some amount for 10 seconds. It's at 44,000 here, and this could be decently strong defensively, but again, in modern WoW, I don't think tanks usually use tons of defensive trinkets, especially one like this that is more of a random proc. And then next up, we have Hand of Justice, a pretty prolific trinket. It gives you agility or strength, and the equip is chance on melee or range attack to deal an extra quick strike attack, dealing some amount of physical damage. Only has a 2-second cooldown. The physical damage is right under 50k, and this one is pretty heavily determined on its proc rate. It has a 2-second cooldown cooldown, which makes me think it's going to proc quite a lot. Then next up, we have Second Wind. Another trinket, gives you intellect, and its on use is restores some amount of mana every 1 second for 10 seconds. Now this has a 5-minute cooldown, but the amount of mana shown on this trinket is right under 280,000 mana. That's a lot of mana even on a 5-minute cooldown, and that will be increased when you're doing like normal or heroic runs of the raid. So in specific situations, this trinket may actually be crazy. And if they're not careful with balancing this trinket, this is one of those trinkets that could potentially end up being used like in the next major patch of the expansion and in the next raid, just because of some certain situation where a healer would need a ton of additional mana. And then we get into weapons, starting with the Hound Master's Bow. And the equipped is your range attacks have a chance to deal an additional 56,000 physical damage, but only to beasts. So I don't think this is going to be super useful depending on what content you're doing, but I don't think it loses any of its secondary sets for this. So this is just additionals. So maybe you're a skinner and you want to plop on this bow to kill creatures more easily. And then we have the Barman Shanker, and this dagger does not have any secondary stats. And the equip is your melee attacks have a chance to cause the target to bleed for some amount of damage over 30 seconds, currently set at 90,000 on this. This could also be something that's quite strong. If it has a decent proc, it could even be really strong in AoE, but it would probably be pretty good on bosses because you'd be able to get that full 30-second bleed off. And depending on what spec or class you're playing, you could have damage increases for bleeds. And then next up, we have Scorching Needle, which is a dagger. This is really interesting because it has no primary stats or secondary stats, but then it has a chance on hit, blast a target for some amount of fire damage, and increases the damage done to the target by fire spells by up to some amount for 30 seconds. If this damage increase from fire spells is stackable, if it is, this could be crazy, but the fire damage proc itself is showing only 5,000, so it's not very strong, and the damage increase is only showing a little under 900, so I'm not sure if this will actually be good, but it is very reminiscent of basically the same thing as it was from the dungeon, so this may be just a flavor weapon, but it also could just be balanced in a way that this thing is actually super strong for like a fire mage. And then we have the Blood Fist, a fist weapon. This doesn't have any secondary sets either, and the equip is your melee attacks have a chance to wound the target for some amount of physical damage, and this is currently at like 200,000 physical damage, so this will probably have a lower proc rate, but that could be quite a lot of physical damage. And also, at least in the data mine version of this, it is not unique equip, so you could potentially use like 2 of these and just massive damage procs off of these, so there could be something pretty crazy with these. And then we have the Magma Shot Boomstick, a gun. The equip is your range attacks have a chance to deal an additional 56,000 physical damage to beasts, so this is basically the same thing as the bow, doesn't lose any secondary stats. Again, if you're a hunter trying to kill some beasts, this could be good. And then we have one of the most prolific weapons from vanilla, the Molten Iron Foe. It was just called the Iron Foe in vanilla. This also doesn't have secondary stats, and the equip is chance on melee or range attack to unleash a Molten Strike, dealing some amount of fire damage. 2-second cooldown, the fire damage is at like 24,000, so it could be pretty good. It is unique equipped, so you can't dual wield these, and no secondary stats, so that means the damage proc has to make up for it. Could actually be pretty good for like an enhancement shaman. It is kind of sad that they don't have the effect from the original, which if you don't know, it was chance on hit to grant 2 extra attacks on your next swing. Now I know why they didn't have it, because that's absurdly strong in modern WoW. Getting 2 additional swings would just be absurdly crazy, especially with a bunch of the other effects you could possibly add on top of that. And then we have the Lord General Sword, a one-handed sword, does not have any secondary stats, and the equip is your melee attacks have a chance to increase your strength or agility by 2,800 for 15 seconds. Now that strength increase is actually bigger than pretty much any other like trinket proc you can get at that item level, and it's for 15 seconds. That's pretty massive, and it does have to be pretty big because it doesn't have any secondary stats. So if this has even a relatively decent proc rate, this thing will probably be pretty good. And then we have the Flame Wraith, a 2-handed polearm, doesn't have any secondary stats, and the equip is your melee attacks have a chance to envelop the caster with a fire shield for 15 seconds and shoot a ring of fire, dealing some amount of damage to all enemies. And the damage shown on this is 210,000, so quite a lot of damage. And I'm wondering what this fight fire shield is actually going to be. Back in vanilla, I'm pretty sure it would just be a shield that blocks fire damage, but in modern WoW, presumably this would just be a shield. And the first thing I kind of thought of when seeing this was, if that's the case, this may be good for like PvP. And then next up, we have the Guiding Staff of Wisdom. The equip is your spells cast have a chance to grant you 2400 of a random secondary stat for 18 seconds. Each proc in combat will cycle to the next secondary stat. And this weapon does have secondary stats on it, so this is basically just another proc for this weapon. And while this is a bit random, that is a lot of secondary stats, so I think this staff will actually be used quite a bit. And then we have the Spire of the Stone Shaper, another staff. This only has one secondary stat of haste, and it doesn't give as much as the two secondary stats, but it does give more than one of the secondary stats would give if the weapon had two secondary stats. And the use is increases armor by 6500 for 10 seconds, but cannot cast skills or attack for the duration of the spell, and it's a 15-minute cooldown, so this weapon just seems to be a flavor weapon. Now, the pretty big amount of haste you get on this could potentially make it still really good for classes that only want a massive amount of haste. Then finally, we have the Force of Magma, which is a two-handed mace, doesn't have secondary stats, but the equip is your melee attack have a chance to blast the target for some amount of fire damage, and the current damage on this is 315,000, which is pretty crazy. So if this proc rate isn't abysmal, this amount of damage proc is pretty crazy. But that's all of the data mined items we have for the upcoming Blackrock Depths raid, and I for one am super excited for this raid. Even looking past that we're just getting a new raid with a bunch of new bosses up to heroic difficulty this early on and in the first minor patch of the expansion, but a bunch of these items are interesting. Even if they're just like simple damage procs or simple stat increasing procs, I think having more gear like this is actually quite interesting. Because even just having some extra damage proc on a weapon, I think makes the gearing just a bit more exciting. And then you have the weapon with the set bonus, which I think is even more interesting. So I'm really excited for this raid. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.